In the previous lessons, we have looked at optimization techniques like useMemo hook and React.memo function, which allows us to avoid re-rendering or recomputation of values. Well, another hook that does something similar is the useCallback. And in this lesson, we'll be learning about how the useCallback hook works, and we'll be seeing examples of how to apply it in our React applications. So firstly, what is the useCallback hook? Well, this hook allows you to memoize function definitions between your re-renders. Just like we saw the useMemo hook, which allows us to memoize or cache computed values so that they are not always recomputed, the useCallback hook is used for memoizing or caching function definitions. If you haven't seen the lesson on the useMemo hook yet, you definitely should. I'll leave a link in the video description. So when we say that the useCallback hook allows us to avoid re-rendering of our applications, what exactly does that mean? Well, let's see an example. So if we come back to this same memo example component, we use the memo function here and we pass the component. Actually, to make this simpler, what I'm going to do is copy that part and I'm going to do memo. So this is a memo example, and then here I'm going to say memo example.prop types, and then I'm going to pass this memo example here. So this way the component is easier to read, and then here we get the memoized version of this component and we export the memoized version. Now, as we understand so far from the memo function, this allows us to avoid re-rendering our components if the props hasn't changed. So if we come back to app.jsx, here where we use memo example, we pass this prop, and this prop. And what we understand so far is that even if you change the state in this app component and everything in this app component is re-rendered, this memo example will not be re-rendered unless when this prop has changed, or this prop has changed, or this prop has changed. Now let's say this memo example also receives a function prop. Let's say we pass a function prop like on change color, and the idea is that in this memo example, when you click on this button to change color, you can allow this app component to run a function. So in this memo example, we can come to our prop types and we can pass on change color. So prop types, this is going to be a function and this should be required. And then here we can destructure the on change color. So here we're going to say when you click on this button, which is this button here, this button is going to set the color state, and then here we can call on change color. So here in this app component now, what is going to happen when the color has changed? Well, let's say we create a function here which we can call on change color, or when color has changed or anything. This function is just going to do console log color has changed, and then we can pass this function to this prop. Okay, now let's open the console. We still have this log here. This log is coming from this part, console log rendered show heading, show pricing cards. Now, when we click on change color, what we have here is color has changed. So our function is working fine. You change color, this function is called, we have our console log. But then if you come to this update state button, if you remember when you click on update state, it calls this function update state, and update state is going to update the state for show use effect comp. So here it's going to change it to either true or false depending on the previous state. Now if I should click on update states, what you notice now is that the memo example component is rendered again. Because it's rendered again, that is why we have this console log running again. But it's not supposed to run again, right? The only props that this component receives is show pricing cards, show heading, the cards object, and the onChange color function. So if these props have not changed, this component should not be re-rendered. And if you look, the only thing that we actually change is the show use effect comp when we call set show use effect comp. So the only reason why this memo example component should be re-rendered is if we pass a prop here called show use effect comp, and then we actually pass that state, show use effect comp. So this should be the only reason why the component should be rendered, because this state changed. But we are not using this prop here. Now, why is this component still re-rendered? Now, as we saw in the previous lesson, we had to use useMemo for the cards array so that we could memoize the reference for these cards, because the reference changes in every re-render. Okay, now we have solved this part for the object or for the array. What about this part, which is a function? And this is where you use the useCallback function. Now, the reason why this component is still being rendered is because this function has different references in every render. In the first render, it has one reference. In another render, it has another reference. In another re-render, it has another reference. And because these references are not equal, that is why the memo function keeps thinking that this prop has changed. So even if this function is the same thing, for the fact that the references have changed, this component will be re-rendered. So we can use useCallback to memoize that reference. So let's also say that this function depends on a state here. I'm just going to use a random example. Let's say it also depends on the selected state. This is just for example's sake. So let's say we have console log color has changed, and we also have console log show heading is, and then we pass, sorry, not show heading, selected card is this. Let's just assume this case. Now, how can we use useCallback for this? This is what we can say useCallback, and we have to import this from React, useCallback. So we can say const on change color is equals to useCallback, and then this useCallback, the syntax is similar to the useMemo. You have your function and then you have your dependencies. So for the function, I'm going to pass an anonymous function, and then I can take this from here and put it here. Then I can remove this function. So useCallback, it takes this function. And what about the dependencies? Well, the dependencies for, well, let me close this because it's disturbing. Well, the dependencies for this function is selected. So now by doing this, the first time the component is rendered, the useCallback is going to memoize this function, and it's going to assign that memoized function to onChangeColor. Now, even when the component re-renders, the only time that this useCallback would run again is if this dependency changes. If you don't put any dependency, that means this useCallback is never going to run again. But if you put a dependency like selected, because in our useCallback we are using selected, so we would expect that whenever selected changes, then we want that to also reflect on this line. So we can put it as a dependency, and this way we can keep using the memoized version of this function, which would only run again when this dependency changes. And that's why at the beginning I said the useCallback is used for memoizing function definitions. So now we have memoized this function, and now only when selected state changes, that is the only time this useCallback would run again. So let's check it out. Now first we have rendered show heading true, show pricing cards true, which is coming from here. Now if I click on this change color button, we have color has changed, selected card is pro, and this runs again. Now why did this run again? Well, this ran again because when you click on this button, it calls set color, and set color updates the color state, and when a state of a component updates, well, everything in that component is run again. So this line ran again. If you remember in the previous lessons, I mentioned that the memo function doesn't stop a component from re-rendering when the state changes. If the state changes, the component will run. The memo function only stops the component from re-rendering when the props changes. So now let's refresh this again. Now let's say I click on update states. If you remember, update states would only update the state of show use effect comp. Now if I click on that, if I go to the bottom here, you can see that the component that was supposed to be rendered below is not rendered. If I click on this again, you can see the component is below because show use effect comp is true. If I click on this again, show use effect comp becomes false and it is not rendered. But one thing you notice here now is that our memo example component is not being re-rendered. Why is it not being re-rendered? Well, that is because this prop did not change. This prop did not change. This prop did not change because we used useMemo to memoize the reference to the cards array. If we didn't use useMemo, that means it would be a different reference here and this component would be rendered again. And then for the onChangeColor, because we used useCallback, we were able to memoize the reference to this function, and because that reference has not changed yet because our dependency did not change, then the memo function can see that none of the props here have changed, so I do not need to re-render this component. So I hope with this example you can now see the job of the useCallback. Depending on the application that you are building, it might not mean anything to you if this component runs all the time, even when it doesn't need to run, and that's fine. But depending on what you're building, this might be a component that you only want to run when certain props changes. If those props have not changed, it doesn't make sense, or it will affect performance of your application if you keep rerunning or re rendering this component. So with useMemo, like we saw from the previous lesson, you can memoize object references, array references, and that way the references stays the same until the object or the array is created again. And with useCallback, you can memoize function definitions, so that way you can pass the references to those functions here, and this component would only run when those references changes. I hope with this example you now understand how the useCallback function works and ways in which it can be useful. If you enjoyed this lesson, please give it a like, share with others. Check out other lessons in the Simplified React course if you haven't yet, and also subscribe so that you are notified when a new lesson drops.